into either Q&A or chat. And yes, I will be sending out the recording afterwards. Thank you, Rafi, for asking that. I don't always remember to say that. So on behalf of the try that again, one more time. On behalf of Jewish Unity Through Diversity Institute, we're very excited today to have Professor Franck Salameh talk about the Jews of Lebanon. He himself is a historian and multilingual translator, biographer, memoirist, and professor of Near Eastern Studies at Boston College. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Middle East and Africa, among many of his other things. I am just going to mention Lebanon's Jewish Community, which was published through Palgrave in 2019, because that'll be the focus of our talk today. And fill us in a little more, Professor Salameh, please, a little bit more about you so we can learn who you are before we get into the history.
Well, I think you summarized who I am.
Personal history, maybe.
Yeah, I grew up in Lebanon. I grew up during the war. I often tell my kids that I slept through the war. Um, I came of age in a multicultural universe. I think I mentioned it to you in earlier conversations. I lived in a building that had, we live in Beirut. It's apartment buildings. It's not homes, single homes like it is in the US. Um, so our building was, had Armenians in it. It had Muslims. It had the Christian Maronites, my own community, and it had Jews. So it was a very diverse universe in which I grew up. So we didn't know. I went to Catholic school. We didn't know who was Muslim, who was, Jewish until Thursdays. Thursday was usually Mass day. We had to go to Mass. So those who didn't go to Mass, we knew that, they belonged to a different community. But, otherwise it was a very diverse universe. And I became fascinated with Jews very early on as a teenager. A couple of events happened. Um, I think I must have been 16, 17. I was at my mom's office. She was an accountant. And I think there was an attack on a Palestinian camp nearby in the vicinity of Beirut, and it was
May I ask, when you say camp, can you describe what a Palestinian camp would look like?
Post 1948, a lot of Palestinians or, Arabs of what was then former British Mandate Palestine took refuge in Lebanon, and they installed them in multiple camps in the south of the country, around Beirut, and in the north of the country. The camp that was close to where my family lived was primarily a camp of British Mandate Arabs who were Christians, because we lived in a Christian zone of Lebanon. So anyway, there was a battle nearby, and I remember Israeli jets flying overhead. And one of my mom's colleagues goes out on the balcony and starts shouting at the airplane. The image is still vivid in my head. God bless you, Israel. God bless you, Israel. And in my young mind, I was like wondering why. Why is this? Of course, I had no conception of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I knew pretty much nothing what was going on, but I was fascinated by this sort of dichotomy between what we get on the news, the Jewish entity that, in Arabic language newscasts, they talk about the Jewish entity. And here was this colleague of my mother praising Israel for an attack. And that I think incited my curiosity about Israel, about the Jewish people. As I said, we had neighbors. And one incident in particular, at a older age, I was 18. And in Lebanon, we have a high school exit exam that essentially decides the rest of your life, whether you go to college or not, which college you end up to, what you study, whether you study medicine or literature or law, etc. So it's a very important exam, and they give us at the end of the spring semester of the last year of high school, they give us 5 weeks where we could, just isolate ourselves and cram for the exams. And I remember my family had a summer home in the Lebanese mountains and was quite isolated. There were no civilization around. And my mom used to come every weekend with food and, cooked home meals, etc., to give me for the week. I was all by myself. And one weekend she comes with a basket of dried fruits and nuts. What is today, what we call I don't know, trail mix or, the granolas or, but this is 1980, 1981. And she says, here, this is from our neighbor, Hnaini, our Jewish neighbor. And this is supposed to give you strength and keep you awake to keep cramming for the exam. Oh, and by the way, she told me that she began a novena on your behalf to the Virgin Mary. So I was struck by that, and I was very, very profoundly moved by it that this Jewish woman, uh, who's openly Jewish. I mean, everybody knew she was Jewish. Um, 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 would begin a sort of a Catholic ritual for this Catholic kid who's studying for a very important exam. And it's, for, your audience, among them who don't know what a novena is, it's a 9 day or 9 night prayer, very ritualistic, that you that you address to someone who intercedes on your behalf, right? And in this case, it was the Virgin Mary, so very Catholic. So over 9 days, you pray for something to happen, either for, a sick person to be healed or for somebody to meet success. So that was the beginning of my cultural, intellectual, and later academic interest in Jews in particular in Israel in more general terms.
Okay, so that was a great overview. Now let's go back because really we're talking history. That was your history. I appreciate that. Now let's go back to the history of the place. And you were mentioning the Arab-Israeli War and the concept of Arabs in the region. And in your book, one of the things, if we go back to the original history of the people and the place, you mentioned that Beirut is not Arab, but it's actually a Canaanite, Phoenician word, the word Beirut. So probably the people there were not Arab originally as well. So can you talk a little bit about that to understand more of the region?
You know, with the background of what's going on today, and me being sort of a junkie, a social media junkie, always on social media picking fights, uh, the kind of intellectual garbage that comes out, things like well, go back to where you came from, or the Jews should go back to Poland, or and my responses are often, if you want to speak in terms of colonialism and anti-colonialism and post-colonialism, Israel is probably the most successful modern example of anti-colonialism. Right? It put an end to Arab colonialism and sort of re-established political presence to a minority people that, and by the way, this is my specialty. I study minorities of the Eastern Mediterranean. So essentially, Jews and Christians, um, of the Levant and their intellectual history. And in that context, I study Arab nationalism and Zionism and other localisms. So long short to say that Israel is a successful example of post-colonialism or anti-colonialism or ending colonialism. So if we want to speak in terms of colonialism and in terms of indigeneity, the Arabs are the newcomers and they're the last in a series of colonialists who, stood at the gates of Vienna twice in the past millennium. So we tend to, in the context of colonialism and anti-colonialism, we tend to look at colonialists um, as Europeans, as those are the colonial. But we forget that the institution of colonialism is very much Arab and Muslim. Not to say that it began in the Near East from the times of the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Egyptians. Um, so so either all colonialism are bad or no colonialisms are bad. So we cannot say one colonialism is good and one is not.
And
So
we're talking historically. I just want to put that out there. We're not talking politically. We're talking historically. You have to put it into context.
yeah, so in terms of indigeneity, the Jews were there first, uh, before the Arabs, before the Christians. So in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, you mentioned Beirut is not Arab, and I mean, uh, um, uh, uh, when cultures disappear, when cultural rituals disappear, when civilizations exit history, the last the last elements of civilization that exit history are place names, toponymy. So you take the toponymy of Lebanon. It's, the country itself is fairly new, but the word Lebanon is Canaanite, right? It's not Arab. So if we want to speak in terms of Arab nationalism and Arabization of the region, um, you mentioned Beirut. Beirut is an Arabized form of the Canaanite Beirut, and Beirut means wells. So it's the city of wells. And Beirut to this day does not have a underground subway system precisely because it sits on a body of water, like fresh water. So you dig, 2, 3 meters into the ground, and you get fresh water. So the toponymy of it was named on account of it being puckered with wells of fresh water. And to this day, in spoken Lebanese, we, we still say bir for a well, whether oil well or chances are it is a water well. I remember a conversation. So, in terms of place names, a conversation I've had years ago with a Palestinian academic from Bir Zayt, a town in the PA in the Palestinian Authority, and out of curiosity, I asked him if he knew what the place name meant, Bir Zayt. He told me, of course, it means the well, the oil well. I told him, well, was it named because there was oil in the place? He said, no, no, no. There's much older. It means the olive oil well. And looking, I don't know if anyone, if you've been to Bir Zayt, you look at it, and there are a lot of olive groves. So I tried correcting him. I asked him, but why would they name a town Bir Zayt for oil well? He said, well, because back in the olden days, we used to store olive oil in these wells. So I asked him if he knew of any any olive oil producer that does that, because this sounded very strange to me. You don't store olive oil in the ground. Olive oil is stored usually in special jars, earthen jars, oftentimes in olden times. But in any case, so I tried explaining to him that the term Bir Zayt comes from Canaanite, and it actually means the water well of the olive grove, because Zayt in Canaanite means olive. In Arabic, zaytun
Right.
means olive, and zayt means oil in Arabic. So it's this is to tell you that when culture exits history, the place names remain, even though they may be sort of changed in pronunciation, Arabized, etc. They tell a story about the place. And in the case of Lebanon, just like in the case uh, of even Arab Palestine or Ottoman Palestine, you travel through towns and places and you see the remnants of those Canaanite or Hebrew names. In the case of Lebanon, about 95% of place names are Canaanite in Aramaic,
Yeah, you
unlike
mentioned
Arabic.
Sidon and Tyre, and
Exactly, exactly.
so yeah. The context is interesting. And then you said the Jews have always been there before the Christians and before the Arabs. Do you know when the Jews came there?
It's not that they came. I mean, speaking, I mean, if you read the Bible, you'll see that the Bible took place in Lebanon, not in Tel Aviv. I mean,
Right.
the Song of Songs and the beautiful poetry is praising Lebanon. So this was part of the universe of the Jews. I don't particularly like the idea that they came or did not come. I mean, the current divisions did not exist. And there's always been this, there's, it was a love-hate relationship throughout history, but there was a relationship between the Phoenicians, who are a Canaanite people, and the Hebrews, later the Israelites, the Jews, who are, I argue, also a Canaanite people. They did not come from elsewhere. We all like to say, because of current events and persecutions of dominant cultures today, we kind of like to imagine that we came from elsewhere. I think the Jews were Canaanites. Usually I use the this analogy of the Jews and the Phoenicians, and I often say that um, um, in classical antiquity, the way you differentiated the Jews or the Hebrews, later the Jews, from the Phoenicians is that if the Jews, if the Phoenicians were the bad boys of antiquity, if the Phoenicians were the Rolling Stones of antiquity, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, they're polytheists, etc. The Jews were the moralizers of antiquity. They're the people who brought law, who brought monotheism. But essentially, they spoke to each other. They spoke the same language. So um, I lost my train of thought. But
Well, I'm going to take you a little bit.
when did they come, etc. Lebanese Jews argue that they've always been there. And I'll give you a quote here from Joseph Farhi, who was the director of one of the Jewish associations of Lebanon. This is from 1930, early 1930s, and this is the beginning of the Nuremberg laws and British Palestine putting limitations on Jewish immigration, etc. And there was a lot of movement in Lebanon because Lebanon was also beginning to accept immigrants coming from Europe, who were denied entry into British Mandate Palestine, whom the Maronite Church in Lebanon began encouraging to come and settle in Lebanon um, um, on endowment lands of the Maronite Church. So in one of his interventions, Joseph Farhi, um, uh, speaking of Lebanon, mentions our attachment to Lebanon is not a modern phenomenon. And I quote, "It has existed for thousands of years. Already Moses solicited God's favor to see the promised land, the enchanting Lebanon." So note the promised land here is, yeah, of course, it's Jerusalem, but Lebanon is part of this promised land. Um, Later, the Entente Cordiale that reigned between Solomon and the king of Phoenicia made it that it was to Phoenician artists and architects that Solomon assigned the task of building his temple in Jerusalem, a temple bedecked with the fragrant cedars of Lebanon, again, biblical imagery, the attraction that the Jews of Palestine have for Lebanon is not a modern phenomenon. Our biblical poets celebrated the marvelous sites, the majestic cedars, which Solomon preferred for building the eternal temple. Time has not diminished our attachment to this land, an attachment that is as solid as it is sincere. End of quote. So it's not a modern phenomenon. Um, um, of course, over time, just like Jews elsewhere adopted or became members of a initially Jewish sect, the Judeo-Christian sect. So all religions begin as sects. When they become very successful, we call them religions. So the early Christians were Jews who believed that the Messiah came. The other Jews are the Jews of today who are still waiting for the Messiah. So for the Judeo-Christians, the Messiah had come, and over time they became Christians, plain without Judeo. But essentially, when the Christians when Jews who wanted to join the club, the Jesus club, they had to first become Jewish. So they had to observe law. They had, if they were male, they had to get circumcised. They had to observe Sabbath, etc. So they were Jewish who simply believed that the Messiah came, and will come again. So it is a long standing presence, and long standing recognition of that presence. I mean, even the Maronites themselves recognize that the Jews everywhere, but the Jews in Lebanon in particular, uh, were a kindred people. They were part of their ethnicity. And during that same time period, incidentally, the Maronite patriarch, who is the head of the Maronite Church in Lebanon, and in the 1930s and so from 1931, 32 until he died in 1955, he was referred to as the patriarch of the Jews. Uh, the term was used initially as a term of abuse, meaning that he cared more for the Jews than he did for his own flock, but he took it as a compliment, and he wanted to be referred to as the patriarch of the Jews, and he took a um, almost combative stance against Arab nationalists who were at the time uh, fighting the Jews of British Mandate Palestine, but also beginning to espouse sort of anti-Semitic tendencies vis-a-vis of the Jews of Arab lands, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Lebanon eventually.
Yeah, and you mentioned that one of the goals of the talk is to talk about Jews of Lebanon as part of, but distinct from the Jews of those other Arab lands. And actually, a question came in that I'm going to roll into this: that why aren't the Lebanese Jews as well known as the Syrian Jews or some of the other Jews of Arab lands?
That's that's a very good question. Um, perhaps um, perhaps presenting the idea that um, that post 1948, the only place outside of Israel that saw a growth in its Jewish population outside of Israel was Lebanon. So a lot of the Jews of Syria, of Iraq, of Egypt, who chose not to make Aliyah and go to Israel, or chose to not, you know, immigrate to the United States or Europe, etc., came to Lebanon for familial reasons, sometimes for cultural reasons, sometimes for economic reasons. They might have had business interests, they might have had family in Lebanon, so they opted to stay in Lebanon. And Kirsten Schultz argues that between 1948 to 1967, uh, the number of Jews in Lebanon more than quadrupled. Okay, so from about 4,000 indigenous Lebanese Jews out of a population of, 1948, I don't know, 900,000 people, a million people maybe. So out of 4 to 5,000 Jews, they grew to about 25,000 Jews by 1967. Beginning in 1967, they began dwindling. Today, there's only a handful of Jews. I could, you know, hyperbolize and say, you could count them on the fingers of one hand. But essentially, the Jews who remain in Lebanon either live quietly or live as crypto Jews, as Christians. Many of them marry into Christian families. So, I'm discovering, childhood friends who nowadays tell me, oh, my grandmother was Jewish or my grandfather was Jewish, but, they went to school with me. Um, the reason why we don't hear much about them um, is because Lebanon went through a very severe transformation in the 1960s, beginning in 1965, actually. There was a very, um, the same reason that made Lebanon attractive to Jews, a very powerful and dominant and influential Christian community, those same reasons made Lebanon less attractive to Jews. A dwindling Christian community, a Christian community that lost its hold on power and that has uh, become sucked into an Arab nationalist or even an Islamist universe. So I don't know if this makes sense, but that's the strength of the presence of the Palestinian armed movement in Lebanon and its weakening of the Lebanese state might have contributed to the dwindling, or definitely contributed to the dwindling of Lebanese Jewry, and therefore hearing less and less about them. And the
That
fact that
makes
Lebanon has been in war for a good part of 40 years since 1972. So there's very little research done in Lebanon proper. There are very little archives available.
right.
One of the first things that the PLO did during the war that began in 1975, that is referred to as civil war, it was actually a war between Palestinians and Lebanese Christians, so there was nothing civil about it. One of the first things that the PLO did was to burn um, state records, burn personal status records, burn anything that leaves traces of officialdom or officiality to the Lebanese state, basically to erase elements or state structures, if you will. In the case of my family, for instance, applying for a visa to come to the United States, you have to provide proof of whatever, birth, or we didn't have those. I still do not have a birth certificate because everything was incinerated, was burnt. So essentially, we had to rely on church documents, right? So the churches keep, all records of hatch, batch, and dispatch, births, christenings, marriages, etc. So this is how we were able to provide proof that we were the persons we were claiming to be. Um, so, but that contributes to the fact that there are very little archives left. And what I was able to gather were essentially personal stories and one end of correspondences and memos from archives outside of Lebanon. So basically,
Right.
I worked in the in the Alliance Israélite Universelle Archives in Paris. I worked at the archives of the Holocaust Museum in DC, and some remnants of journalistic accounts.
Well, also you mentioned that 4,000 was really the indigenous number of Jews that were there. So that's a pretty small number. I guess they had moved out throughout the years as well,
Yeah,
is what it sounds like,
yeah.
or
I mean,
converted.
yeah, small considering. I mean, the populations were small back then. I mean, it's
Right.
But, for a place like Lebanon where you have 18, 19, 20 different ethno-religious groups, that number is considerable. If you count 1940s, 750,000 population, 4,000 would be what? I don't know, 2%, uh, less
I'll
perhaps.
let you do the math.
Uh, but that, yeah, I'm not good at math. But so is the Druze community in Lebanon, not the Jews, the Druze, which is an
Druze.
offshoot of Shiite Ismaili Islam, are also a very small community, throughout the Middle East, including Israel, which has probably the largest community. Uh, Syria and Lebanon, there's no more than 1 million Druze today.
Right. And when you talk about the Druze and you talk about different communities in the area, you mentioned that there were 20 legally recognized ethno-religious groups in Lebanon. And I'm assuming today there are not still 20 within the
No, they're
government.
still the same. They're still recognized, but they have different kinds of impact or influence, if you will. I mean, yeah. So there's still Maronites, there's still Chaldeans, there's still Assyrians, there's still Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Armenian Catholics. Those are the what I call ethno-religious
Mhm.
communities, and Sunnis and Shiites and Alawites and Druze, etc. It's
But
what
they're
what
all recognized still by the government.
there's yeah, they're all recognized, and they are essentially, rather than counting them as religious groups. That's why I insist on the term ethno-religious groups, because political scientists define these people as pre-modern national churches. So they are national, even. I'm not saying church in the Christian sense,
Yeah.
the church as a gathering, as a congregation, as a knesset in Hebrew. Um, um, so they're national churches before the term nation or nationalism emerged in the 17th, 18th century. So to give you an example, the Anglican Church is the National Church of England. This is the official name. And I don't know if you watch the coronation of King Charles III, he gets coronated, and before him kneels the Archbishop of Canterbury. Why? Because King Charles is the head of the Anglican
Right.
Church. So that's what I mean by ethno-religious groups, or pre-modern national churches. Those are nationalities or nations or ethnicities defined religiously. The Jewish example is the perfect example. It's a nation that is today defined religiously as Jewish. And Arabs like to, and Arab nationalists like to make that distinction. Oh, we're not, anti-Jewish. Judaism is a religion. We are anti, Israel, or, not anti-Semites because they claim also
No,
Semites.
that doesn't work anyway. Semitic. But there's an interesting comment here. I am of Chaldean descent, and this is my complete understanding of my roots. I self-identify as a Judeo-Christian. It may be worth remembering that the idea of a Judeo-Christian ethnic influenced the world for many millennia. So I just wanted to put that comment there, as we have different groups in here too, but somebody in the meantime asked, what is a Chaldean? So since you mentioned it and this person mentioned it, maybe you can just give us a little understanding.
The Chaldeans are one of the national churches of Iraq. They are the Christians of Iraq. Um, they are, um, um, I, I think they are in communion with the Catholic Church. Uh, they are a pre-modern national church, unlike the Maronites, for instance, and I would say also unlike the Jews, who revived their ancestral language in modern times, 19th century. There was a linguistic revival of Hebrew as a spoken language. The Chaldeans actually still speak their ancestral language. They speak Chaldean, which is a dialect of Aramaic. You see other pre-modern national churches, for instance, the Coptic Church, they have relinquished their ancestral language, which is Coptic, which is a descendant of ancient Pharaonic, uh, and relegated it to ritualistic and ceremonial purposes. So it is even though they speak a variant of Arabic today, uh, their um, their liturgical language remains Coptic. So they pray in church in Coptic, very much, to assimilated Jews who might have relinquished, Hebrew or Aramaic, who's espoused, Ladino or Yiddish, etc.,
Yiddish.
and then revived Hebrew. That's the case of the Copts. That's the case of the Maronites, for instance, my church. I know Aramaic because that's my church language, but I'm reciting stuff in Aramaic. Whereas I speak today modern Lebanese, which is, a mix of languages, including Arabic. The Chaldeans, on the other hand, have kept their native language. To this day, they speak a variant of the ancient Aramaic of their ancestors. I
Thank you. And
hope,
one of the things, I think
yeah.
that answered it, but we'll watch the comments. I will monitor. So Dr. Karam is saying that the numbers really dwindled after 1976, and that's really when people moved out. I actually have a little, I don't know if I told you this before. I met this person who left in about 1990 and moved to Israel, and he was drafted into the army, right? Because he was a young guy who came from Lebanon, and he wasn't allowed to serve in the Israeli army for to fight against Lebanon. He had to serve at a different front because he wasn't allowed to. I'm just saying, people came out later, is what I was trying to say, is at the
Yeah,
76. I think that's another distinction between them and Jews of other Arab lands.
yeah, yeah.
But in the meantime, he's also asking if you worked at the JDC archives for your book.
It's been such a long time. Help me out with what's the JDC?
Joint Distribution Committee.
No, 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 no.
Okay.
Um, um,
Um,
let me
Right.
see.
So Leslie's actually saying that she is from Lebanon herself. She's a Jew from Lebanon. And so she's interested in finding out more about her community. So I'm going to plug Professor Salameh's book because there's a lot in there about your history. So I would highly recommend that. You can say what else to read if you want.
So mainly, I have to tell you this anecdote about to tell you how things have changed from 2015 when I began my research, 2014 actually, till today. The the archive of the Alliance Israélite Universelle in Paris is a very rich archive. So I did a lot of work in that. I did a lot of work also at the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives and the archives of the World Jewish Congress. Some of those are available at the Holocaust Museum in DC. You had to, for the Alliance Israélite Universelle, everybody knew where that archive was, where the office was. There was a plaque on the door. You ring the bell and you go in. As recently as last April, this April of this year, I was in Paris and I just wanted to pop in and say hello to the archivists that I worked with. I knew the street. I could not find the building, okay, because they removed
Any
all
signage. Yeah.
any signs that would indicate that this was the Alliance Israélite Universelle. Um, and this is actually, the French term Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Israelite alliance, the International Israelite, Universal Israelite Alliance. The Jews of Lebanon to this day are still referred to legally as Israelites, okay? Not Jews, because that's the original French term from the 1920s, and it remained in legal documents, in constitutional documents, articles, etc. and so um, in Lebanon, voting happens by community. On your voting card, there is the communal um, belonging, that whether you're a Maronite voter or a Shiite voter or a Jewish voter in Lebanon would be listed as an Israelite. So my town, let's say, will have, let's say, 18 votes that will come from the Israelite community. Those are Israelites. And that's not an issue. It becomes problematic in today's climate when you translate Israelite into Arabic. The translation of Israelite into Arabic is Israeli. In
Hmm.
Arabic, it's Israeli,
Which is Israel.
which means
Mhm.
Israeli, not Israelite. So this, feeds into this, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic universe in which we live, and that contributes to the fact that Jews in Lebanon, regardless of what their numbers are today, would prefer not to self-identify as Jews. And I remember
Right.
early on in my research, because I know that the community kept documents. They do have, we're talking about humanity's first literate people. The Jews wrote everything and about everything. So I know there's a lot of information. And my interlocutor refused to even give me a hint that he would be willing. I was in Beirut at the time, 2016. He said, "We have no documents. Everything is gone. Everything got burned or destroyed or whatever." So they do not want to give information about themselves. Those who remain want to be left alone and live quietly, especially in today's climate where Hezbollah is the dominant political force in Lebanon. That even Christians who were very self-confident in earlier times no longer want to stand up to the Hezbollah types.
But some of the things that did survive, or at least survived longer, I don't know what's still there given the current situation, but Leslie's asking about pilgrimage sites, Jewish pilgrimage sites. If you can tell us a little bit about some of those.
The main pilgrimage sites, Jewish pilgrimage sites in Lebanon, are in the south of Lebanon, unfortunately, and they are um, under the control of Hezbollah. So I mean, who would want to self-identify as a Jew visiting a pilgrimage site that is controlled by Hezbollah? Even the Magen Avraham, the main synagogue of Beirut, a beautiful specimen of late 19th, early 20th century Jewish architecture, which was completely destroyed, then completely beautifully
Yeah.
renovated today. You cannot visit it. It is essentially protected. It's cordoned off, and nobody can go in. Um, I tried to sort of breach the sort of fence that was put over it. They have armed guards that forbid anyone from going in. So that was a 2005 political breadcrumb. Essentially, the Lebanese government embarked on this renovation with Jewish money. I mean, this is Lebanese Jewish diaspora who funded most of the renovations, but nobody is allowed to approach it because of the current
But
political
those are the
climate.
synagogues. Are there any like graves or something that used to be pilgrimage sites or?
Um, in I don't know that they're pilgrimage sites, but they're the I know that the Beirut Jewish Cemetery is within the confines of the Beirut Maronite Cemetery, and this is tended by the Maronite
Within?
within, yeah, within.
Interesting.
It's separate plots, identifiable, but within the same sort of uh, larger cemetery that is today part of the Maronite Church endowment, and it's a Maronite church that essentially protects the site.
Interesting.
I visited in 2000, 2000 2016, and the place is well tended to, well taken care of. The site, another major site. It's heartbreaking to talk about it, uh, but the Sidon Cemetery, um, and there was a Lebanese scholar, Naji. Some of your audience might have heard of him, Naji. I forgot his last name. He passed away recently. He was the only person who was allowed entry into those sites to
Naji
sort
Zaidan.
Naji Zaidan, thank you. Um, who was tending to those places, keeping track of the tombstones, sorting things out, writing them down. But the place is really desecrated. It's desecrated, literally desecrated. Yeah, unspeakable things done to it that I can't mention. This is according to him. I've never been. I cannot enter the place. Um, so those
So,
are that's the extent of what I and this is very early on. This is beginning in 1948. So 1948, the Arabs of British Mandate Palestine, as they walked from the areas they left or were expelled from, they landed in southern Lebanon and began harassing local Jewish communities, essentially squatting their homes and kicking them out. And that's, and I think in the vicinity there is a mentioned earlier Palestinian refugee camps.
yeah.
There is a refugee camp in that vicinity. Um, yeah.
So I think Professor Breitschneider was a little confused, or not confused, sorry, I didn't mean it that way. I meant she wanted to clarify that even today there is place on the registered group that says Israelites, that it's
Yes, yes,
still
yes, yes. In recent, somebody sent me a couple of months ago a list of registered electors in the town of Zahle, which is in the Bekaa Valley, which is a Christian town. And I think in the town there were 12 electors listed as Israelites. Israeli. So
okay.
in Lebanon, the benefit of Lebanon is that it's still, in many places, it is still bilingual, even though officially Arabic is the dominant language. So you see Israeli, you do have the French translation Israélite, which is different from Israélien. Israélien would be Israeli, Israélite would be Israelite.
Okay. If you're semantics, yeah, that's a problem. It's a lot of it is semantics today also.
So,
Eh,
without taxonomy, without words,
you're
we're
right.
nothing. I mean, the major war that is being fought today is a war of words
Right. That's
and
why I was
and
like,
and
that,
and the meaning of words. So that's why I'm a bit of a stickler when it comes to taxonomy. I waste a lot of time over it, but I think it's important. This is the only
well, you
this
spend a
is
lot of time. Don't say waste. Spend.
words. Yeah, I mean, words are our only bridge to knowledge and our bridge to the past and hopefully to the future. Without words, we're
Well, talking about words, there were two questions about books. Can we take another 5 minutes? I know we're at the
sure, sure,
1 hour
sure.
mark,
Yeah.
but
If I'm
so there
able
were
to answer, I will.
There was a, well, this one you can because it's about you too, but Charles Figali, no, if I'm pronouncing that right, said that your story is fascinating. I enjoyed reading your book. I too grew up in Lebanon and lived through the Civil War. My wife wrote the book Glass Cedars that talks about Lebanon post 1975. And he's asking what motivated you to write your book. I know I also took a note to take a look at that book. So thank you for telling us, Charles. So he's asking what motivated you to write your book. And somebody else asked if you have books that you might recommend from other authors about Lebanon, Lebanese authors.
Yeah. Oh, about Lebanon or about the Jews of Lebanon?
I will take a look back. Notable Lebanese Jewish descent. Yes, Lebanese Jewish descent.
Yeah, I highly recommend Kirsten Schultz's book on the Jews of Lebanon. It's titled The Jews of Lebanon. This is, I think, this is the trailblazer, and this is actually what motivated me to write my own book, because I wanted it to be a research-based academic book, and you will see that it's, I hope that it's very academic, but it's also a personal journey. I wanted to write a memoir, right? A memoir is not necessarily history, but this is a memoir and history. And it took me years of negotiations with the publishers, and I went to multiple publishers, and that's why I opted eventually with Palgrave, because I wanted the text. Usually, you read academic books and you have endnotes. And I'm a person who's I'm an active reader, and I don't like texts that have endnotes, because I read something in the main text and I have to flip to the endnotes to look at references. So it took years
Right.
of negotiations to get the publisher to agree to putting footnotes. This way, you're reading the main text and you go down to the bottom of the page for references. So even in the memoir section of my book, I have also references that connect the memoir, the stories told to me by Lebanese Jews and other Lebanese who encountered Jews, and I connect them to actual historical references. Um, some pages of the book, if anyone happens to read it, you may notice that there are, on a page you have a four-line paragraph, and the rest of the book is a big footnote. That I wanted that, and because I wanted the memoir to be corroborated by factual history.
Thank you. And that answered that. And then I don't know if you know these people as well. Thank you, Yitzhak, for adding some extras. I don't know if you can recommend them or not. Guy Barahan and Tomer Levy, he suggested reading.
Tomer Levy actually writes on the Jews of Beirut. His book is excellent. Tomer is Israeli, and what motivated him is probably what motivated me. Um, when I was still teaching at Brandeis, he was a doctoral student at Brandeis, Tomer, and he does come. I think his grandmother is a Lebanese Jew. Um, so
So that's where
that's
I have it.
also his. So you'll see. I mean, although Kirsten Schultz is not connected in any way to Lebanese Jewry, you'll see a lot of and there's a lot of work today in Israel proper. A lot of the Israelis who come from Lebanese descent are writing memoirs. Jacques, somebody help me, Jacques. I want to say Jacques Derrida, but it's not Jacques Derrida. Jacques something, an Israeli from Lebanese descent, who actually who actually went to the same school as I did.
Oh, wow.
He's a graduate of my high school, and he tells a story of when he was part of the IDF that came to Beirut in 1980, 1981. And the first trip, he was an officer. The first trip he did was to that school. And he encountered some of the old priests that taught him. And he talks about it in a very emotional I saw the YouTube years ago. He actually tears up when he talks about, encountering those old priests that essentially, in difficult times in the 1960s with at the height of Arab nationalism and Palestinianism, Jews of Lebanon suffered. And that's why 1967 is a I don't know what you could call it, a threshold or
Yeah.
a turning point, if you
Sure.
will,
Yeah.
when the exile began.
I think unfortunately that's something that in many, when you say they're distinct, the Jews of Lebanon are distinct from Jews of Arab lands, 48 and 67 were like the two, I think.
Yeah.
But thank you for everybody who has been adding into the chat. I encourage everybody to look at the chat. I'm also taking notes, so I will send it in the follow-up email, suggestions and comments, as well as a link to Professor Salameh's book. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank
I
you for
really
the
appreciate
opportunity. Thank you
this.
for listening. Sorry for the mishap early on. And
I'm
if there are
sorry.
any questions, I'm happy to answer questions. You know, my mind is there's a lot of information, there's a lot of things. Uh, but you know, obviously I'm not as prepared as I should be. But I can give a lot of references. You know, I can, as I said, I'm an active reader, so I read something and I write in the margins. So if there are any questions at all, I'm happy, if I'm able to, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you. So if that, with your permission, I'll share your email as well in the follow-up
Excellent.
email.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. You also stay safe.
Yes, wherever you are.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye bye.